Welcome to the John Carter Brown Library and to this evening event, which is really a celebration of maps, and the first in what we hope will be, at the very least, an annual series of talks related to the history of cartography and the history of maps in this extraordinary collection of maps. I'm Neil Saphir. I'm the director of the library and an erstwhile historian of cartography myself, although I don't have a lot of time to focus on maps in the way that I would like. But earlier in my career, I was attracted to maps because maps are documents that are both extraordinarily beautiful, but I think also extraordinarily confounding. They bedazzle us, they intrigue us, they invite us in, they depict space, but they also challenge us to think a little bit about, or in some cases a lot, about what our relationship is to territory, to questions of space, to topography, which is a term that has been used recently in this library. And they are a very curious a fusion, really, of text and image. And it is really this kind of connection between text and image, which is what this evening's lecture is going to be about, with a focus on the cartouche, a very prevalent but very understudied aspect of cartographic history. So these maps, which in many ways have no entry point, they present themselves, and unlike a book, they don't ask us to begin on the first page and end with the last. They instead invite us to explore them as we are in the process of looking at them. There are also, in this collection and elsewhere, indigenous maps, there are material maps, there are metaphorical maps, and there are schematic maps. Maps range widely. And we just had the privilege yesterday of hosting here at the library a workshop that was conceived of by Holly Schaefer, professor in the history of art and architecture here at Brown, her colleague Shahzad Bashir in the Middle East Studies Department, as well as colleagues from Yale University and elsewhere, in a workshop entitled Viewing Topography Across the Globe, exploring one of the important elements of this collection, which is its global reach. As I mentioned, the JCB has an extraordinary collection of maps, but John Carter Brown didn't begin collecting maps as a separate category. He was interested in books, books on the history of the Americas, and he only really collected maps as they were present in the books that he purchased. It wasn't until John Nicholas Brown, his son, who is located above me in the painting, began to realize that maps were a fundamental part of the process by which Europeans came to understand what they had found when they arrived in what they considered to be a new world. That this was a series of geographic incidents or accidents that began, in fact, long before Columbus, as the Portuguese were exploring the coast of Africa and the islands in the middle of the Atlantic. For the past 2 years, we have had the pleasure of having with us at the library Chet Van Duzer, a renowned specialist in the history of cartography, and tonight's speaker. Chet is a longtime researcher in residence at the JCB, and has also been a board member of the Lazarus Project at the University of Rochester, and he's also an alumnus of the University of California at Berkeley. He is known as to be a prolific scholar of the field, especially of medieval and Renaissance maps, having published 7 books and more than 30 articles on this topic. One book in particular that has had very wide circulation is on sea monsters on medieval and Renaissance maps, translated into 4 different languages. He has worked at the Library of Congress, the British Library, the Huntington Library, the Princeton University Library, Stanford University Libraries, and the John Carter Brown Library, in addition to probably about 50 or so other archives and libraries that didn't get onto this list. And he came here to work initially on a fascinating map from 1587, the Urbano Monte map, owned by the Rumsey Map Center in Stanford, at Stanford University. Some of you know David Rumsey is an extraordinary map collector, a map proselyte, and also a digital somebody who's inspired this library to expand its digital collection, and he also serves as a member of the Board of Governors. So with that introduction, it is my great pleasure to invite Chet Van Duzer for this evening's lecture to speak about this wonderful feature of maps, the frames that speak. Chet.
Well, thank you, Neil, for that generous introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here this evening and to speak about my current book project, which is precisely about cartouches. Cartouches are certainly one of the most visually engaging elements of maps, and really they're also one of the most important elements of maps. And I'll begin with a couple quotes about cartouches, one from J.B. Harley. "The cartouche is the pictura loquens of cartography. Like the emblematic title page or frontispiece, it serves to abstract and epitomize some of the meaning of the work as a whole." And a quote from Stephanie Pratt, "Far from being marginal, the cartouche constitutes the map." So we're really talking about one of the most important elements of a map. And if we think about looking at a map of a region of the world in which, as it happens, we don't have a particular interest, where do our eyes go? Our eyes go immediately to the cartouche. The cartouche is a spot on the map where there's a privileged communication between the cartographer and the viewer. It's in the cartouche and its decoration that the cartographer reveals some of his or her interests or prejudices. And so it was surprising to me that there wasn't a book about cartouches. And so when I started to think about cartouches a couple of years ago and realized that there wasn't a book about them, I understood that I had a wonderful opportunity in front of me. And as I got more and more engaged with the material, I began to appreciate even more what a great opportunity it was. It's just fascinating artwork on maps. The idea of my book is to look at the most elaborate, the most complex cartouches, the ones with the richest symbolism. But in order to do that, one has to give that discussion context by looking at the history of cartouches right from the beginning. And a couple things, the fact that there isn't a book about cartouches means that several aspects of cartouche research had never been properly touched upon or fully developed. And one of those was that I found that the definition of cartouche, the definitions that were available of the word were not really very satisfactory. I also found that no one had looked at the earliest history of the cartouche. What is the earliest cartouche that appears on a map? So I'll begin with my definition, which is a framed device containing text or decorative elements together with associated adjacent decorative elements. So I really think the frame is the essential thing. And as we'll see, though, a key feature of cartouches that wasn't addressed in any other definition was the fact that the decorative material immediately adjacent to the frame has to be considered as part of the cartouche. And as in the application of many definitions, we need to keep a little flexibility. So the frame, for example, is not always complete. In this case, we have in front of us what we will, I think, all recognize as a cartouche. The frame consists of these trees. The trees do not meet at the top, so it's not a 100% complete frame, but I think we have to accept that this is, in fact, a cartouche. With regard to the decorations outside the frame, so here we have its framed title information, but we also have two native men on either side. We have a mountain above, we have animals below, and we have a landscape. And we have to accept all of this as part of the cartouche. I mean, I think we have to accept the men as part of the cartouche. That part is immediately evident. But if we accept the men, we have to accept the rest of it as well. And this is, we'll see many cases where the extra elements outside the frame proper can be really very extensive. We have here a whole crowd of animals and people which are outside the frame but must nonetheless be considered part of the cartouche. I'll take a quick look at the earliest use of the word cartouche in English, at least the earliest I've been able to find so far. There's a lot more that could be said about the etymology of the word, but I'll pass over some of that material for lack of time. The first use I found in English of the word cartouche in a cartographic context, and it's important to emphasize that, is from 1839, and it was part of a legal case. Alexander Humphreys Alexander claimed ownership of a huge swath of eastern Canada based on legal documents affixed to the back of a map, and the trial turned on the genuineness of these documents and thus in part on the date of the map. So this is not the map that was actually in the legal case, but another copy of that same map. So the French bibliophile Villeneuve was called to give his opinion as to the date of the map, and he wrote a letter expressing his opinion, which was translated into English as part of the proceedings. And part of that letter reads, "I have also the same maps, especially that of Canada, in which the denomination of first geographer is wanting, and which has a, quote, cartouche, scroll or tablet, and engraved ornaments, different from the, quote, cartouche and ornaments of the map which contains the title of first geographer to the king, and the two maps have, nevertheless, the same date, 1703. The important part here for us is the use of the word cartouche in quotation marks, indicating that it will not be a familiar word to the reader, and with an explanation. And we would expect something like that in the first use of the word in English. So I'll say a bit about the early history of cartouches. The earliest convincing cartouche I've found is in a nautical chart by Giovanni da Carignano from about 1327, which we see here in a facsimile. The original was lost in a fire, but a facsimile was made before its loss. Just to orient ourselves, here's the Iberian Peninsula. And if we zoom in on North Africa, we can see that we have a few cases of descriptive texts in frames. So again, this is the earliest convincing case that I've come across so far. If we move forward in time a little bit to the famous Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most elaborately decorated nautical charts to have survived. Just to orient ourselves, we have the Iberian Peninsula, the Red Sea is helpfully in red, and Taprobana is at the lower right, which is usually identified with Sri Lanka. If we zoom in on the area around Taprobana, we can see that we have three texts, framed descriptive texts, so three cartouches. In this case, the framing is interesting. We do have a line marking the frame, but we also have the wavy pattern indicating the ocean stops, and we have blank space on the parchment. So it's really framed in two different ways, by the lack of the wavy pattern and by the rectangular box. Again, moving forward in time to Fra Mauro's famous Mappa Mundi of circa 1455, which is in the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice. We zoom in on the Atlantic. We can see here that we have the beginning of some decorative cartouches. So the frames are in the form of scrolls. So they're not just a simple rectangular or oval frame, but there's some decoration to them. And I'll mention a few Cartouche Firsts. So here we have Johannes Ruysch's world map of 1507, which was printed to appear in the 1507 and 1508 editions of Ptolemy's Geography. It has a quite extensive program of cartouches, so these framed descriptive texts. But I want to focus on these two, which are on the western coast of South America and the western coast of an island a bit to the north. And these seem to be the earliest use of cartouches to hide geographical ignorance. So Ruysch didn't know the contours of the western coasts of these two landmasses, so he plopped a cartouche down over that part of them to not have to commit to a specific coastline. Here's Martin Waldseemüller's Carta Marina of 1516. It has a very extensive program of descriptive texts, the vast majority of which are undecorated, so they're simple rectangular frames, but two of them are decorated. And it's interesting which of the two Waldseemüller chose to decorate. I've said that cartouches are a privileged space of communication between the cartographer and the viewer, and his choice of these two particular cartouches to decorate plays with that theme. So if we look at the smaller one, with its elaborate rope work and vegetal decoration, this is where Waldseemüller indicates that he has the legal right to publish the map. So it's metadata that relates to the publication of the map. So it's about the production of the map. So it's closely related, that the cartographer is declaring something rather than just describing a particular region. And the larger cartouche of the two that are decorated has ropework decoration, vegetal motifs, and two dragons at the top. And this is the cartouche in which Waldseemüller explains his reasons for making the map and how he went about making it. So again, a privileged communication between the cartographer and the viewer, and that's one of the two cartouches he chose to decorate elaborately. This large cartouche serves another function on the map. Waldseemüller uses it to avoid committing to whether it's possible to pass by sea around the southern tip of South America. So if we zoom in and we imagine approaching the southeastern coast of South America, we can see there's a line that seems to indicate the end of knowledge going to the south. And if we imagine trying to sail just south of that line, we would bump into the cartouche. So he uses the cartouche in part to avoid committing to whether it's possible to pass by sea around South America. So those were some of the earliest elaborately decorated cartouches. This is one of the earliest cartouches that tells a story, and particularly the story of the Last Judgment. So we have a framed text about the Last Judgment on this map, and then this very elaborate depiction of all the parts of the Last Judgment, really telling the whole story in this painting, this decoration that flows from and thus is connected to the framed text about the Last Judgment. So having looked at some cartouche firsts, I'll say a bit about the sources of cartouches. So one way a cartographer might get a cartouche is to commission it. He might commission a special artist to draw a cartouche for him or her. So here we have exactly such a drawing that happens to survive. There are not a large number of them that do survive, but this is a drawing for a cartouche that was made by Peter Jans in 1659, which is in the National Library of Australia. And in this case, we have not just the drawing, but also the map in which the drawing was used. So here is that map, Joan Blau's map of the Eastern Archipelago, as he calls it, first printed in 1659, this copy from 1663. Here is the cartouche. We'll zoom in. There it is. And if we put the drawing above the printed cartouche, they're very similar, but as we look at the two together, we start to realize they're not identical. And what's happened is that they're reversed left to right. So in engraving the cartouche, the artist saw no point in reversing it. He just copied it directly, and then it was reversed in the process of being printed. It's worth mentioning there's an extra figure in the printed cartouche, and I don't know whether the drawing, part of the drawing has been lost, or whether this was something added by the cartographer, rather by the engraver. So a cartographer could commission a cartouche for a map, but there were other ways of obtaining cartouches. And one of them is from pamphlets of cartouches. So pamphlets were these pamphlets which are just collections of cartouches for use by artists in various media were published, beginning around the middle of the 16th century. And we see the title page of one of those cartouches here. The title is, it's a little but very useful book about many and various protractios, which is one word for cartouche that was used in this title, which means diagram, which are also vulgarly called compartments. So another name for cartouche, an early name for cartouche, compartment, which has a certain sense to it. And so we'll look at an example of a cartouche that came from this pamphlet. So this is Ortelius's map of New Spain from 1579. We'll zoom in on the cartouche and put it beside one of the cartouches from this pamphlet. And we can see that Ortelius just copied the cartouche directly. So this was another and much less expensive way to obtain a cartouche for use in a map. And just to look at another pamphlet from the 18th century, whose title we see at the bottom, it's by Chauffard. It's a Cahier des Cartouches from the middle of the century. And here we have a map of Minorca also from the middle of the 18th century. If we zoom in on the cartouche, we can see, again, I put the cartouche from the pamphlet on the left, the cartouche from the map on the right. They are not quite identical, but again, this is a case where if we flip the cartouche in the pamphlet, we can see that it was copied directly by the engraver and then was reversed when it was printed. So a cartographer could commission a cartouche. He or she could copy a cartouche from a pamphlet, and the cartographer could also copy a cartouche from another map. And I'll show an example of that from the map that Neil mentioned I was working with in the JCB earlier, which is Urbano Monte's spectacular world map of 1587. I've highlighted one of the cartouches near the bottom of the map here. And if we zoom in, through a stroke of good luck, I managed to find the source of this cartouche, which was a map published about 30 years earlier, a map of Scandinavia published about 30 years earlier. But returning to the history of cartouches after this brief digression into the sources of cartouches, in the 17th century, cartographers began illustrating cartouches with local peoples, animals, plants, and products. And I think when we think about cartouches, this is something we think of as pretty typical. So here's Willem Blau's map of the West Indies, again, first published in 1630, this copy from 1660. If we zoom in on South America, we can see that the cartouche is decorated with native peoples of South America. And the same is true in Africa on this map. So if we zoom in on the cartouche, we have this spectacular ivory tusk, and so one of the products of Africa and some local people. So at the same time that these elaborate cartouches showing local peoples, plants, animals, and products were being produced, in other quarters, tastes in cartouches were changing in another direction, which is to say towards simpler cartouches. And of course, there's no reason to expect that all the producers of maps would move in aesthetic lockstep. People had different interests and different tastes. But this is, I think, a rather dramatic example of changing tastes in cartouches. So this is the sixth map of Asia from the 1618 edition of Ptolemy's Geography. And the plates come from the 1578 edition of Ptolemy's Geography, whose maps were designed by Gerard Mercator and are usually regarded as the most beautiful maps in any printed edition of Ptolemy's Geography. And because of that, the plates were reused in several different editions of Ptolemy's Geography. And in particular, they were reused in the 1618 edition that we see here. And if we zoom in on the cartouche, we can see it's very large, very elaborate. It has this elaborate strap work, as it's called, and a grotesque at the top. And we'll zoom back out to the map. So again, this is the 1618 edition. The plates were reused again in the 1695 edition. The geography was not changed at all, but all of the cartouches were scraped off the plates and replaced with much smaller and less elaborate cartouches. So this was a very considerable undertaking in terms of both time and expense. And why would it have been done? Because by 1695, Mercator's cartouches from 1578 were thought to be hopelessly out of date, too large and distracting. And thus, someone evidently felt, we don't have a textual discussion of this change, but someone felt that the cartouches were so out of date that they would impede the sales of the book. So they paid to remove all the old cartouches and replace them with new ones, which are much smaller. And if we look closely, we can see that that in the process of removing the cartouche, the little dots indicating the ocean were also removed. So we have this blank space around this smaller cartouche. And we have these same two editions of Ptolemy's Geography on display here, showing this very dramatic change. And we can see an interest in having less elaborate or fewer cartouches on maps in other quarters as well. So here we have Willem Blau's world map of 1606. When it was first printed, this copy is from 1638, printed by his son, Joan Blau. So my point here is that Joan Blau had some involvement with this production. And it has a fairly elaborate program of cartouches within the map proper. Joan Blau himself made a world map in 1648, which we see here. And while there's substantial decoration outside the map proper, there are very few and small cartouches, that is to say precisely two, within the map itself. And in a later map, also made by Joan Blau in about 1664, there are no cartouches in the map proper, even though there's, again, elaborate decoration in the area around the map proper. Another example of changing tastes in cartouches, so this is John Speed's map of a county in Ireland made in 1611 to 12, and we can see that it has large and elaborate cartouches. Well, Joan Blau made a copy of this map using essentially the same geography, the same borders, but he was content with one much smaller cartouche in the lower right, and one coat of arms above. So it's a very clear indication of a different taste in cartouches between the two cartographers. While Joan Blau was making maps with fewer and smaller cartouches than the models, elaborate cartouches continued to be produced in Europe in the late 17th and 18th centuries. I'll just show one example of such a cartouche here, which is an Homann's map that shows the Great Christmas Flood of 1717. So we can see we have an inset map, which is the frame that defines this part of the map as cartouche, but then this very elaborate storm decoration immediately adjacent to it, and thus part of the cartouche, showing lightning and thunder and rain pouring down. And the map actually illustrates in the inset precisely the parts of land that were flooded in the Christmas flood of 1717. So again, while some cartographers were making less elaborate, were choosing to make less elaborate cartouches, others continued making very elaborate ones. And then to close this quick survey of the history of cartouches, there was a general decline in elaborate cartouches in the late 18th and early 19th century. Again, there are certainly exceptions to this, but I think it's fair to say there was a general decline. And a couple of scholars have offered suggestions about the reasons for this change. So George Kish suggested that decorative cartouches declined following the Napoleonic Wars as maps became more utilitarian, while Mary Pedley has suggested that decorative cartouches declined following the French Revolution because of the end of noble patronage, royal support, and increasing interest in quote-unquote scientific mapping. Both of these factors, I think, are important, but the picture is actually a little bit more complicated than that. So we can find relatively simple cartouches before the French Revolution, for example, in the maps of Mentel, such as this one, in his Cosmographie élémentaire, printed in 1781 and 1785, where the cartouche is a simple rectangular frame where we seem to be going back to the very earliest cartouches. And at the same time, it wasn't the case that immediately following the French Revolution that elaborate cartouches disappeared. So we have in this map of Pierre Lapie a somewhat elaborately decorated cartouche with a sphinx and palm trees in his map of Africa from 1812. But later, 4 years later, in 1816, he did eliminate that decorative cartouche and go to just a simple oval frame for the title information. And I could offer many other examples from Lapie's cartography. And by 1831, there's not really a cartouche anymore at all. I don't quite think we can call that a frame around the title information. But I'll now get to the heart of my talk, which is looking at some really elaborate cartouches, the more complex ones that really interest me. And I'll begin with the famous world map by Gerard Mercator of 1569, which we see here. The contrast is not great, so just to orient ourselves, here's Africa, South America, and North America, which we'll zoom in on. You can see there's an enormous cartouche there. Here are the outlines of the continent, and we can see that this spectacularly large cartouche occupies much of the middle of the continent, with multiple texts and this elaborate allegorical scene at the top. And this is another use of a cartouche to hide geographical ignorance. So Mercator didn't know what was in the center of the continent, and he's chosen to cover that area with this very large cartouche. And this cartouche operates to hide geographical ignorance in another way. So again, at the top, we have this allegorical scene with personifications of peace, justice, and piety. And that precise part of the map covers up this area where we might know whether Mercator thought there was a northwest passage. So we have open water to the left of the cartouche, open water to the right of the cartouche. Did he believe that there was a passage? He's plopped his cartouche down right in that area so that we don't know what he thought. Looking at Cellarius's new map of Asia, we can see again a very extensive program of cartouches. We'll focus on just one of them in the lower left. Maps from 1590. So we have this long text and an illustration about the source of mummy, which was used as a medicine in Europe. So the idea was that somehow pieces of Egyptian mummies, although there was some dispute about where they came from, whether these things called mummy were actually from Egyptian mummies, were used as medicine. And the cartographer talks about the source of this mummy and then has this illustration showing where he thinks the pieces of mummy come from, and he clearly thinks that they are in fact pieces of Egyptian mummies. So we have these representations of the pyramids at a very small scale. We have tombs being opened. We have the mummies being removed from a tomb, carried and loaded on camels for transport. So he's very clear about where this medicine comes from. We look at Jodocus Hondius's world map of 1608. This is the only surviving copy of the map in the Royal Geographical Society in London. So again, just to orient ourselves, here's Africa, South America, and North America, and we'll zoom in and we'll see that once again, we have a spectacularly large cartouche occupying most of the interior of North America. And this cartouche is really particularly interesting, I think. So again, here's the outlines of the continent. We have this enormous cartouche with various parts. So here we have Noah and his three sons, Japhet, Sem, and Shem. And there was this idea that Noah had divided the earth among his three sons following the flood. And so the three sons of Noah came to represent the continents, and in some cases functioned as sort of personifications of the continents. So in between Noah and his three sons, we have personifications of the continents. So each with a banner describing that continent. So Africa, America, Europe, Asia, and then there's a fifth female personification, and perhaps it's supposed to be North and South America, or perhaps that fifth personification was added, or at least in part, to achieve symmetry. But what we have here is something really quite remarkable. We seem to have a passing of the baton, as it were, from one system of representing or personifying the continents to another. So from Noah and his sons to these female personifications of the continents that were so popular in 16th century Dutch art. A wall map of the world by Pieter van den Kier from 1611, another Dutch cartographer. We'll zoom in on the map proper and see that again there's a very extensive program of cartouches, and unsurprisingly we have a large cartouche occupying much of North America. But I'll zoom in on this cartouche, which occupies a large part of the Southern Ocean. So we have this frame at the bottom, which makes this a cartouche, and it's an academy, as the cartouche indicates, of famous astronomers, mathematicians, and cartographers, Euclid, Archimedes, Ptolemy, Ortelius, and so on. And so this huge cartouche occupies an enormous part of the Southern Ocean. And I think in this map, one can't help but feel that there's a little bit of horror vacui operating, this fear of empty space, because so much of the oceans are filled with decorations. Here we have an elaborate cartouche on a globe. This is Van Langeren's terrestrial globe of 1630 to 32. And we have it's an extremely Eurocentric image. So we have a personification of Europe at the center, receiving as offerings products from personifications of various other parts of the world. And then we have this very long text about the sources of various exotic goods, some of the same goods that are being offered to this personification of Europe, including precious stones and spices, and then helping to frame the cartouche images of exotic plants, including spices. So we have these exotic goods in basically 3 places, twice represented graphically and once textually in this elaborate cartouche. This is Vischer's map of Lower Austria from 1697. Again, it has a very extensive program of cartouches, and again, we'll just look at one of them, which is at the bottom of the map here. And zooming in, we have actually the cartographer is represented twice. So once holding this banner with the map's legend, and then another time surveying. So it's that frame with the map's legend that makes this whole scene a cartouche. And this is a very clear case where we can feel that connection between the cartographer and the viewer in the cartouche. We have the cartographer looking right at us and showing us information about the map. It's really quite striking. This is Vincenzo Cornelius' map of Africa from 1691. And it's an intriguing case where a large cartouche that talks about the sources of the Nile is used to hide precisely that part of the map. So does he want to give us the information or doesn't he? It's quite interesting. And as we can see, he could have put this information about the sources of the Nile in the ocean to the right, and he could have depicted what he thought the configuration of the Nile was, but he didn't want to do that. So if we zoom in and look at the elements of the cartouche, we can see we have a personification of the river Nile. And very interestingly, we have this fellow who's kneeling on a globe and stepping on books and maps. So these materials are being treated with great disrespect, and we're to understand that this is older knowledge that's being treated in this very aggressive way, while we have here the light of new knowledge and this long text about the history of the search for the source of the Nile, and including information about the very latest discoveries. So at the same time that he's using this graphic element to cover the part of the map where he might depict the sources of the Nile, he's giving us information about the sources of the Nile, so it's quite surprising. Cornelius' cartouches in general are quite wonderful. Here we have the cartouche from his map of the Greek archipelago. And this is an interesting case where the cartouche indicates the cartographer's political interests and desires. So we have the winged lion of Venice holding a torch, approaching this facade, which serves as the surface on which the title information is written. And at the right, the fire is making the Turks flee. So Cornelius expressing his desire that Venice would assert itself and push the Turks out of the Greek archipelago. And cartouches can also be used for religious purposes. So this is Scherer's map of Africa from about 1710. And Scherer uses the Christian area, marks the Christian areas of the map in white, while the non-Christian areas are dark. It's really quite dramatic, would be one word for it. And we have this very large cartouche at the left, which again qualifies as a cartouche because of the framed text at the top. And we have this banner that reads, to give light to them that sit in darkness and in the shadow of death. And then we have peoples of Africa sitting in a shadow with death right about to strike them. So this is Martellus Souter's map of Louisiana, essentially from 1720, which has a spectacular cartouche here that tells in a graphic form about the collapse of the so-called Mississippi bubble investment scheme in France. And it was organized by a Scotsman, John Law, and involved a monopoly on the development and trade in French North America. So if we zoom in on the cartouche, we have a personification of the Mississippi pouring forth riches, and a banner that says fortune favors the bold. Cherubs and Lady Fortune issuing stock certificates in the company, and the eager recipients of those stock certificates below. But on the other side, we hear the rest of the story, we see the rest of the story. So we have cherubs now with empty purses, the ruined investors, and below we have cherubs with boxes of worthless stock certificates. So the whole history of this, the collapse of this financial scheme told schematically and artistically in the cartouche. And yes, the cherubs blowing bubbles are referring to the Mississippi bubble. So one of the cartouche we saw at the beginning, another cartouche by Souter, and part of this project has been getting to know the works of particular cartographers and finding one's favorites among them. And Souter's cartouches are very impressive, like Cornell's. So in this large cartouche, we have Neptune on the left favoring the maritime enterprises of the King of Portugal. And below, this inset map of Portugal's possessions on the coast of Brazil. So we have the map of Portugal and then Portugal's possessions in Brazil. So indicating very clearly the political and economic interests of the mother country. And then, very interestingly, within this cartouche, in the inset map, we have another cartouche. So this is what's called mise en abîme, the thing within the thing. And that's often a very interesting aspect of cartouches. Another map by Souter, his map of postal routes in Germany from 1729. A very complex image. So he has a banner with a motto below that says, "The link of the human race for both pleasure and utility," referring to the postal service, and this image of the earth. And then he has two letter writers, one human and the other the god Mercury, so a divine letter writer, both linked to the earth with these ropes. And then we have three terrestrial letter carriers, again linked to the earth with these ropes that I've indicated with the dots. And then one celestial letter carrier, again linked to the earth with this rope. So showing how this network of letter writers and letter deliverers unite the world. Dramatic cartouche in Nolan's map of the Americas from 1740 at the lower left. So we have some native peoples dismembering, cooking, and eating other people. And then we have European soldiers firing on them at very close range, while Mars, the Roman god of war, with the French fleur-de-lis, looks on. And so the cannibalism, alleged cannibalism of New World peoples and other so-called barbaric habits of theirs were often used to justify European aggression against them, and we have a very dramatic illustration of that idea in this cartouche. Another cartouche by Souter from his map of New France, that is to say Canada, in about 1750. If we zoom in on the cartouche, we have at the top a European holding an indigenous man by a leash, a very disturbing image. On the left, we have Diana, the goddess of the hunt, and below and to the left of her, scenes of hunting. On the right, Neptune, the god of the sea, and above and to the right, scenes of ships at sea. And then I think it's fair to say that things get particularly interesting lower down, where we have a cartographer at work. And the cartographer is actually making a map of Canada, which is quite similar to Souter's own map. And we can see that the cartographer is holding to the right the scales of justice. So the cartographer is trying to produce a just map, and in what respect? Well, we have below the coats of arms of France and England. So he's trying to produce a map that balances the political interests of France and England. And we have two people watching on, Mercury, the Roman god Mercury, and a general, so indicating that there's a lot riding on whether this map does that job fairly of balancing the political interests of England and France. The wonderful map by José Joaquim da Roca, made of part of Minas Gerais in Brazil in 1777 or 1778. If we zoom in, we can see on the left, we have a native man pointing his bow and arrow at the European on the right, and the European man is doing something with a map. He's consulting a map or making a map, and this speaks volumes. It shows very clearly that indigenous peoples of the New World knew that if Europeans come around making or using maps, trouble is sure to follow. And I'll end with a map of Boston. This is Henry Pelham's map of Boston. And we have this trompe-l'oeil image here, a cartouche, defined by the edge of the paper, which forms the frame. And he shows the past that allowed him to move back and forth across the military lines and thus create his map. So we have in the cartouche the document that enabled the map's creation. And so this is another case where we have this special communication between the cartographer and the viewer in the cartouche. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chet, for that wonderful panorama of the diversity of cartouches. We have a little bit of time for some questions, but we will also have the opportunity for you to take a look at some of the maps that were highlighted in the collection. I won't, or in the exposition. I won't ask what number of maps came from the JCB, because that would take too much statistical analysis. But we do have time to range widely in terms of what the cartouches represent. Please.
Why do you feel it's necessary to define a cartouche as enclosed in frame rather than just as part of the decoration of the map?
Well, there's other types of decoration that can be on a map. So so you could just have an inset scene, so why is it different? It does seem different. It's the frame sets it off from the rest of the map and defines it as a different space, and for that reason, I think it does merit a different name.
Okay, thank you.
Did the cartographer go on the exploring voyages, or were they sedentary back in the early and fed information from the explorers to these maps? How did it all work?
There were certainly cases where the explorers were making maps, or they had cartographers with them on voyages of exploration. But many of the maps were made by people who did not go on voyages. So there's no general rule. But I would, if forced to hazard an estimate, I would say that the majority of maps were made by people who had not voyaged.
And this was all Eurocentric, what you've shown tonight.
Yeah.
So if one were making a map in Peru, simultaneously at the same time, or in Istanbul, would they have cartouches in theirs, or is it just a Eurocentric phenomenon?
There are, to talk about examples from Peru, there are maps made in Peru influenced by European models that have cartouches. I've seen an 18th century Chinese map, which was certainly influenced very heavily by European models, and has cartouches, but they're deployed very differently than they are in European maps. So each of the cartouches, rather than conveying information, is basically an image of a scholar's stone. So cartouches have been adopted by cartographers in other cultures, but in those cases have often been put to different uses.
One last question. This is, were there particular countries or cities that were the big kahunas who got the publicity or the respect because they were just such powerhouses, or was it all pretty egalitarian?
In terms of making cartouches?
Yeah.
In
And maps.
In maps, well, the centers of map production certainly moved over time. So the 16th century and 17th century, the Netherlands were the center of map production, and then it became France. But in terms of cartouches, it's hard to generalize, really, and it's at the same time interesting to look at the development of cartouches, and in particular cartographers such as Cornell. His early cartouches are beautiful and imaginative. He has one, I think it's in the South Pacific, that's in the form of a seashell with pearls around it, but there's no symbolism. So he came to the idea of using this elaborate symbolism later in his career.
So you said that there's a general decline in cartouche production after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, to the point where I would say, since none of these maps were from after the early 1800s, are pretty much near extinction. What do you think caused the basic extinction of cartouches, since you said you don't think the French Revolution or Napoleonic Wars directly contributed?
Yeah, well, I want to clarify that I think the Mary Pedley's statement, I think, is valuable, that the decline of the support of cartographers by the French kings, for example, for many years there was a royal cartographer, and that support went away following the French Revolution. But I think an important factor was changing ideas about what maps should be, should be, and the idea that maps should really be practical tools that guided one, whether at sea or on land, and something very precise, and somehow the decorative elements were thought to interfere with that. Yes.
And second related question, which is, do you think that they've sort of been supplanted, or some of their functions been carried on by the modern key or legend, because it's also bounded by a border and contains information that helps you understand the map better?
Yes. And there are decorative maps from the 20th and 21st century, 19th, 20th, and 21st century that do have cartouches that harken back to that tradition. But if we look at the maps we usually encounter in the course of the day, that they are without cartouches.
Great, Jack. That was awesome, really interesting. I had a question. You said, this is about the term cartouche, because I'm an archaeologist, and if I hear that term, I think of Egyptian cartouches. And I didn't get, did you say the first use of it was in 1839?
In a cartographic context.
In a cartographic context. Yeah, let's I guess, in your kind of looking at this as a term that gets used in cartographic contexts, do you see a relationship between how it initially gets applied to the frames around pharaonic names and kind of...
Yeah, that's a good question, and I haven't seen that connection. Which, the function of those cartouches is very similar. It's setting something off from the surrounding area. So it's a little surprising not to have encountered that connection, but thus far I haven't.
Last question, Tess?
Yeah, thank you for this really interesting talk. I also had a question about the etymology of cartouche, but maybe I'll leave that aside because I'm very interested in the argument that you're making about using writing to kind of replace or stand in for cartographic knowledge. And so specifically when you were talking about Ryan, you said, okay, he's writing here about possible sources. But I'm curious as to how common that was. So in these maps of North America, for instance, when you see these huge blocks of text, what do those say? Are they trying to establish the cartographer's expertise through language rather than through drawing, or are they just kind of digressions? What are they?
Yeah, the case of the Nile map by Cornell is particularly interesting in that there is that contrast between what the text is trying to do and what the image actually does. But for example, on Mercator's map of the world from 1569, where we have this huge cartouche in North America, he's not trying to establish his expertise, and he's not talking about North America. He's talking about his theories about what makes for a good government. So it really has nothing to do with the surrounding area. And in the Reusch map, where we have the cartouches on the west coast and so concealing geographical ignorance, in those cases the cartouches do have to do with that part of the world. So it depends on the case. One can't generalize.
So before we thank Chet for this lecture, we also I just wanted to say that this lecture is the ideal framing device for the end of this year, because this will be the last event, major public event anyway, that we have. So it's only appropriate that we are able to gaze upon these extraordinary documents and these extraordinary frames, and that we're able to do so with the expertise and keen eye of Chet. So thank you very much, Chet, and please join us to look at some of the other materials that we have laid out there.